The October mist hung low over St. Mary Mead that morning, wrapping the village in a soft grey shroud that muffled sound and blurred the familiar outlines of cottage gardens and hedgerows. It was the sort of morning that made one grateful for a warm fire and a second cup of tea, though Miss Jane Marple, stepping carefully along the damp cobblestones with her knitting bag tucked securely under her arm, had always rather enjoyed the mysterious quality that fog lent to even the most ordinary scenes. She was making her way to St. Bartholomew's Church for what had become, over the past several weeks, something of a village tradition, the early morning choir rehearsals that Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth had instituted in preparation for the Harvest Festival service. Mrs. Ashworth, who had returned to St. Mary Mead some 3 years prior, following her husband's death in diplomatic service, had taken the somewhat ragged village choir firmly in hand, with results that were, by all accounts, quite remarkable. One simply cannot expect to achieve anything worthwhile, Mrs. Ashworth had declared at the first parish meeting following her arrival, without proper discipline and adequate preparation. Her voice, still possessing much of the clarity that had once graced drawing rooms in embassies from Cairo to Constantinople, brooked no argument. Within a month, she had reorganized the entire musical program of St. Bartholomew's, instituting regular rehearsals, acquiring proper music stands, and somehow persuading even the most reluctant singers to attend practice sessions that began, rather dramatically, at 6:30 in the morning. Miss Marple paused at the lych gate, her keen blue eyes taking in the scene before her. The ancient church, its Norman tower rising solidly through the mist, seemed particularly atmospheric this morning. Warm yellow light glowed from several of the windows, suggesting that others had already arrived for rehearsal. She could see Dr. Haydick's motor car parked somewhat haphazardly near the churchyard wall. The good doctor served as the choir's bass, possessing a voice that, while not particularly melodious, was certainly robust enough to provide what Mrs. Ashworth diplomatically termed foundational support. As she approached the church door, Miss Marple encountered young Timothy Hartwell, the village's part-time organist, who was standing uncertainly on the path, his music case clutched in one hand and a distinctly troubled expression on his pleasant, earnest face. "Good morning, Timothy," Miss Marple said gently. "You look rather perplexed. Is something the matter?" Timothy, a serious young man of perhaps 25, who supplemented his modest income from the organ by giving piano lessons to the local children, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Oh, good morning, Miss Marple. I'm sure it's nothing really, but, well, the church door's locked." "Locked?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "How very unusual. Mrs. Ashworth is always most punctual about these rehearsals." "Yes, that's just it," Timothy continued, his brow furrowing. "Her bicycle is here. You can see it there, by the wall, and I thought I saw a light in the vestry window when I arrived. But when I tried the door, it wouldn't budge, and there's been no answer to my knocking." Miss Marple considered this information with the careful attention she gave to all irregularities in the normal pattern of village life. Mrs. Ashworth was indeed a woman of rigid habits, and the idea of her arriving early for rehearsal, only to lock herself inside the church, was distinctly out of character. "Perhaps," she suggested mildly, "we might try the vestry door. I believe there's a separate entrance around the side." Together they made their way along the narrow path that skirted the church. The vestry, a small stone addition built in the previous century, had its own entrance through a heavy oak door set deep in a Gothic archway. As they approached, Miss Marple noticed that this door, too, appeared to be closed, though a thin line of light was indeed visible beneath it. Timothy knocked firmly. "Mrs. Ashworth, it's Timothy Hartwell. Are you quite all right?" The silence that followed was profound and somehow unsettling. Miss Marple found herself studying the door more closely, noting that while it appeared closed, the latch did not seem to be properly engaged. "Timothy," she said quietly, "I think perhaps you should try the handle." The young man hesitated for a moment, then reached out and turned the iron handle. The door swung open with a low creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. The vestry beyond was warmly lit by the electric lamp that Mrs. Ashworth had installed at her own expense, claiming that proper illumination was essential for the care of choir robes and music. The familiar scents of old wood, candle wax, and lavender sachets drifted out to them along with something else, a faint metallic odor that made Miss Marple's expression sharpen with concern. "Mrs. Ashworth," Timothy called again, stepping across the threshold. Miss Marple followed close behind, her trained eye immediately taking in the scene before them. The vestry, normally kept in perfect order under Mrs. Ashworth's exacting standards, showed signs of disturbance. A chair was overturned near the tall cupboard where the choir surplices were stored. Sheet music lay scattered across the floor, and the small table where Mrs. Ashworth kept her attendance register and rehearsal notes had been pushed askew. But it was the figure lying motionless behind the table that drew their immediate attention. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth lay on her side, her silver hair, usually so perfectly arranged, spread across the stone floor like spilled silk. Her eyes were closed, and her face, in the warm lamplight, appeared oddly peaceful. Around her throat, however, was wound the emerald silk scarf that had been her signature accessory, wound far too tightly, and with a precision that spoke of deliberate intent rather than accident. Timothy made a strangled sound and stepped backward, his face draining of color. Miss Marple, however, moved forward with the calm efficiency of someone who had, unfortunately, encountered such scenes before. "Don't touch anything, my dear," she said quietly to Timothy, who seemed frozen in the doorway. "We must send for Dr. Haydock immediately, and the police." She knelt carefully beside the body, not touching but observing with the methodical attention that had served her well in previous unfortunate circumstances. Mrs. Ashworth had been dead for some time. Several hours, Miss Marple judged, though she was no medical expert. The woman's clothing was neat and undisturbed, suggesting that whatever had happened had occurred quickly and without a struggle. Rising slowly, Miss Marple's gaze swept the small room once more, noting details that might prove significant. The overturned chair, positioned as though someone had risen from it hastily. The scattered music, which appeared to be the pieces selected for Sunday's harvest service, and most intriguingly, the vestry window which stood slightly ajar despite the morning chill. "Timothy," she said gently, turning to the young man who still stood transfixed in the doorway, "I need you to be very brave now. Go to the vicarage and telephone Dr. Haydock. Tell him there's been an accident at the church and ask him to come immediately. Then ring the police station in Much Benham and ask for Inspector Slack. Can you do that?" Timothy nodded mutely, seeming grateful to have a specific task to focus on. As his footsteps retreated down the path, Miss Marple remained in the vestry doorway, her mind already beginning to work on the puzzle before her. Mrs. Ashworth had been a woman of strong opinions and stronger will, the sort of person who, while generally respected, was not always beloved. Her reforms to the choir had been effective but not universally popular, and her tendency to speak her mind on matters of village governance had occasionally ruffled feathers, yet Miss Marple found it difficult to imagine what could have driven someone to such a desperate act. The sound of hurrying footsteps on gravel announced the arrival of Dr. Haydock, his medical bag in hand, and his usually jovial face creased with concern. Behind him came the Reverend Clement, the village vicar, still in his dressing gown and looking thoroughly bewildered. "Good heavens, Miss Marple!" Dr. Haydock exclaimed as he approached. "Timothy said there'd been an accident, but he seemed quite beside himself. What's happened?" "I'm afraid," Miss Marple said quietly, stepping aside to allow the doctor to enter the vestry, "that it's rather more serious than an accident, Doctor. Mrs. Ashworth is dead, and I fear the circumstances are suspicious." Dr. Haydock's examination was brief but thorough. When he emerged from the vestry, his expression was grim. "She's been strangled," he said bluntly. "Sometime during the night, I'd estimate. This is definitely a matter for the police." As if summoned by his words, The sound of a motor engine could be heard approaching through the mist. Inspector Slack of the Much Benham Police had arrived with his usual efficiency, though Miss Marple noted with some amusement that he looked distinctly disgruntled at being called out so early on what should have been a peaceful morning. "Well, Miss Marple," Inspector Slack said as he climbed out of his car, his tone carrying its familiar note of resigned acceptance. "I might have known I'd find you here. Another of your interesting cases, I suppose." "I'm afraid so, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with gentle regret, "though I do wish it were otherwise. Poor Mrs. Ashworth was such a dedicated woman, whatever one might have thought of her methods." As Inspector Slack began his preliminary examination of the scene, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the implications of what they had discovered. A murder in St. Mary Mead was shocking enough, but a murder in the church vestry suggested something particularly personal and vindictive. Someone had wanted not merely to kill Mrs. Ashworth, but to do so in a place that would maximize the scandal and disruption to the community she had worked so hard to organize and improve. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the familiar outlines of the village beyond the churchyard. Soon, Miss Marple knew, the news would spread through St. Mary Mead with the inexorable efficiency of village gossip. By tea time, everyone would have their own theory about what had happened and why. The challenge would be separating the wheat from the chaff, distinguishing between idle speculation and genuine insight into the darker currents that flowed beneath the placid surface of village life. Standing in the vestry doorway, watching Inspector Slack methodically document the scene, Miss Marple found herself wondering not who might have wanted Mrs. Ashworth dead. That list might prove surprisingly long, but rather who among the seemingly respectable inhabitants of St. Mary Mead had possessed both the opportunity and the cold determination necessary to carry out such a calculated act of violence. The harvest festival service, she reflected with a touch of irony, would certainly be memorable this year, though not at all in the way Mrs. Ashworth had intended. The news of Mrs. Ashworth's death moved through St. Mary Mead with the swift efficiency that only village gossip can achieve. By 9 o'clock, the essential facts had reached every cottage and shop, though the interpretations varied considerably depending upon the temperament and prejudices of the recipient. At the post office, Mrs. Easter was holding court with characteristic authority. "Mark my words," she declared to Miss Hartnell and the baker's wife, "this has foreign intrigue written all over it. All those years abroad with her diplomat husband. One picks up enemies in such positions. Probably some vengeful spy, finally tracking her down." Miss Hartnell, adjusting her ancient hat, disagreed with relish. "Nonsense. It's jealousy, pure and simple. She displaced half the choir with her reforms. Some people don't take kindly to being told their singing isn't up to standard." Meanwhile, outside the butcher's shop, Mrs. Price Ridley was expounding her own theory to a growing audience. "I said from the beginning that Mrs. Ashworth was too managing by half. These modern women, always reorganizing everything, well, you see where it leads. Someone finally took exception to her interference." "But surely not murder," protested Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, looking genuinely distressed. "My dear woman," Mrs. Price Ridley replied with grim satisfaction, "you'd be amazed what passions lurk beneath the surface of village life. I've seen it before. Small grievances festering until they explode into violence." At the village green, a third theory was taking shape. Colonel Melchett, still bearing himself with military precision despite retirement, was convinced of a more prosaic explanation. "Robbery gone wrong, that's what this is. Some vagrant thought the church would be easy pickings, didn't expect to encounter anyone. When Mrs. Ashworth surprised him, he gestured significantly with his walking stick." Dr. Haydock, having completed his examination, shook his head. "The timing's all wrong for that theory, Colonel. She was killed well before dawn, hours before anyone would normally be at the church. What was she doing there at such an hour?" "Perhaps she couldn't sleep," suggested young Timothy Hartwell, still pale from his morning's discovery. "She was very particular about the harvest music. Maybe she went to practice her conducting. In the middle of the night, Mrs. Bantry's voice carried a note of theatrical skepticism. Even Mrs. Ashworth's dedication had limits. Miss Marple, making her quiet way through these various discussions, listened with the patient attention she gave to all manifestations of human nature. At each stopping point, she observed not merely what people said, but how they said it, and more significantly, what they chose not to mention. No one had yet remarked upon the curious choice of weapon, Mrs. Ashworth's own silk scarf, when any number of more practical methods presented themselves. No one questioned why the vestry had been disturbed, but not searched, suggesting that theft, if contemplated, was secondary to the main purpose. And most tellingly, no one had asked why the murderer had chosen the considerable risk of committing the crime in the church itself. As she paused outside the vicarage, Miss Marple reflected that 3 distinct theories had crystallized: foreign intrigue from Mrs. Ashworth's diplomatic past, local resentment over her choir, reforms, and simple robbery interrupted. Each theory revealed as much about its proponents as about the crime itself. "The curious thing," she murmured to herself, recalling the scene in the vestry, "is that Mrs. Ashworth was wearing her choir pearls over her cardigan. Such a particular woman would surely have arranged her appearance properly at home, unless she had dressed in great haste, or had not expected to dress at all." The village was settling into its theories with comfortable certainty, but Miss Marple suspected that the truth lay in directions no one had yet considered. Someone in St. Mary Mead had planned a remarkably calculated murder, and they were now watching with satisfaction as their neighbors pursued explanations that led away from, rather than toward, the real motive. The afternoon promised to reveal much more. Inspector Slack's investigation proceeded with characteristic efficiency, though Miss Marple observed that his methodical approach, while thorough, tended to focus on the obvious rather than the illuminating. He had commandeered the vicar's study as his temporary headquarters, and by mid-morning had begun the systematic questioning of those connected to the choir and the discovery of the body. The first significant revelation came from Timothy Hartwell during his second, more detailed interview. Under Inspector Slack's persistent questioning, the young organist revealed information that cast the morning's events in an entirely different light. "Mrs. Ashworth asked me to meet her at the church this morning," Timothy explained, his earnest face creased with concern. "She was quite specific about the timing, said it had to be before the regular rehearsal began, and that discretion was essential. I assumed she had concerns about one of the choir members and wanted to discuss them privately." Inspector Slack leaned forward with interest. "Did she indicate the nature of these concerns?" "Not directly, but she seemed rather excited about something. She mentioned having discovered something that required immediate attention, as though she had solved a puzzle that had been troubling her." Timothy paused, then added, "She said it was a matter of considerable importance regarding the harvest service." Miss Marple, quietly observing from her corner chair, found this revelation particularly significant. A woman who had discovered something important enough to warrant a clandestine meeting, who had been murdered before that meeting could take place. This suggested motives far more serious than village resentments over choir reforms. While Inspector Slack continued his formal interviews, Miss Marple employed her own, more subtle methods of investigation. Her first stop was the village shop, where Mrs. Weatherby, despite her obvious distress, proved a fountain of useful information. Poor Mrs. Ashworth was in only yesterday, Mrs. Weatherby confided, arranging tins with nervous energy. Bought her usual Ceylon tea and ginger biscuits. Mentioned she was expecting a busy night, preparing for the harvest service. Said something about loose ends needing tying up before the big day. The timing detail proved crucial when Miss Weatherby revealed she had heard Mrs. Ashworth's bicycle, with its distinctive squeaky chain, passing her window just after midnight. This information, when combined with Timothy's account of their planned meeting, painted a picture of a woman who had discovered something significant and was taking considerable risks to address it. Miss Marple's subsequent conversations around the village revealed the complex web of relationships and grievances that surrounded Mrs. Ashworth. At Mrs. Bantry's, she learned of Mr. Ponsonby's resentment over being displaced in the choir's tenor section. He threatened to leave entirely, Mrs. Bantry reported, but then decided he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. More of a sulker than a murderer, though. A chance encounter with Mr. Ponsonby himself while he tended his roses provided additional insight. His complaints about Mrs. Ashworth's difficult nature extended beyond musical matters to her involvement in village affairs. She had opinions on everything, he said, snipping dead roses with unnecessary force. Particularly vexed about the recent dispute over the old church glebe land. Thought the council was being rather underhanded. This reference to the glebe land dispute intrigued Miss Marple considerably. The matter had been a quiet but persistent source of controversy, involving several prominent village families and questions of proper procedure in the land's proposed sale. Dr. Haydock's medical examination added another crucial piece to the puzzle. She showed no signs of struggle whatsoever, he reported to Inspector Slack within Miss Marple's hearing. Either she knew her attacker well enough to feel no alarm, or she was taken completely by surprise. Given Mrs. Ashworth's naturally cautious nature, I'd say she was approached by someone she trusted implicitly. By afternoon, several theories had crystallized among the villagers. Mrs. Price Ridley remained convinced of foreign intrigue from Mrs. Ashworth's diplomatic past, while others favored the idea of an interrupted burglary. Colonel Melchett suggested a vagrant, though the timing made this increasingly unlikely. Miss Marple, however, was developing a very different understanding of events. The careful arrangement of the scene, the use of Mrs. Ashworth's own scarf, the midnight timing, and most significantly, the planned secret meeting, all pointed to a calculated murder designed to prevent the revelation of information that someone considered dangerous. As she walked home through the village lanes, Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Ashworth had been killed, not for what she had done, but for what she was about to reveal. The question now was identifying what secret was worth committing murder to protect, and who among St. Mary Mead's seemingly respectable inhabitants possessed both the knowledge and the desperation necessary for such a calculated act. The harvest festival, she mused, would indeed be memorable this year, though not for the musical excellence Mrs. Ashworth had so carefully planned. Inspector Slack's methodical approach to the investigation had, by the second day, crystallized around what appeared to be the most obvious suspect. The evidence against Mr. George Ponsonby seemed to accumulate with satisfying efficiency, though Miss Marple observed that the inspector's enthusiasm for a quick resolution sometimes outpaced his attention to inconvenient details. "We have motive, means, and opportunity," Inspector Slack announced to the assembled worthies in the vicar's study, consulting his notebook with evident satisfaction. Mr. Ponsonby had been publicly humiliated by Mrs. Ashworth's choir reforms, relegated from his cherished position as lead tenor to what he described, rather bitterly, as background accompaniment. Several witnesses heard him declare that he would see her brought down to size before submitting to such treatment. The inspector's case extended beyond mere musical grievances to more serious matters. Mrs. Ashworth's recent involvement in questioning the parish council's handling of the old glebe land sale had put her directly at odds with Ponsonby, whose cousin served on the council and stood to benefit considerably from the proposed development. Her methodical examination of the paperwork had apparently uncovered irregularities that could prove embarrassing, if not legally problematic, for those involved. Mrs. Ashworth had scheduled a meeting with the diocesan office for next week, Inspector Slack continued, specifically to discuss her concerns about the glebe land transaction. Mr. Ponsonby was well aware of this, having been present at the parish council meeting where she announced her intentions. Dr. Haydock shifted uncomfortably in his chair. George Ponsonby may be pompous and vindictive when crossed, but I've known him for 20 years. He's more inclined to write angry letters to the diocesan magazine than commit physical violence." "Desperate men do desperate things, Doctor," Slack replied firmly. "The financial implications of the Glebe land sale are considerable. We're talking about thousands of pounds in commissions and development profits. When Mrs. Ashworth threatened to expose irregularities in the process, she became more than a mere annoyance." Miss Marple, quietly working at her knitting in the corner, found herself troubled by several aspects of the case against Ponsonby. While the motive appeared substantial, the method struck her as entirely wrong for a man of his temperament. Ponsonby's grievances had always been aired publicly, often with theatrical flourish. The calculated precision of Mrs. Ashworth's murder, the deliberate use of her own silk scarf, the minimal disturbance to the scene, the careful timing, suggested a mind accustomed to methodical planning rather than passionate outburst. "Inspector," she ventured gently, "might I ask about the timing?" Young Timothy mentioned that Mrs. Ashworth had arranged to meet him at the church that morning to discuss something she had discovered. If Mr. Ponsonby was indeed the culprit, why would he choose to act before this meeting could take place? Inspector Slack waved dismissively. "Probably learned of the meeting somehow. Village gossip travels fast. Realized she was about to share whatever evidence she'd gathered and decided to act before she could do so." But Miss Marple was not convinced. Her own observations of village life suggested that Timothy Hartwell was remarkably discreet about such matters, hardly the type to spread gossip about confidential meetings. Moreover, the precision required to intercept Mrs. Ashworth at exactly the right moment suggested inside knowledge of her plans that went beyond casual eavesdropping. A conversation with Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, added another troubling element to the case against Ponsonby. "George may be difficult about the choir arrangements," Mrs. Clement confided, "but he's been wonderfully considerate since my husband's health began failing. He brings vegetables from his garden twice a week and never mentions payment. I simply cannot reconcile such kindness with cold-blooded murder." More significantly, Mrs. Clement revealed that she had indeed observed lights in Ponsonby's cottage during the crucial hours, but they had been in his sitting room rather than his bedroom, accompanied by the familiar sounds of his gramophone playing operatic recordings. "He often has difficulty sleeping," she explained. "Music helps him relax. I heard Puccini until nearly 3 o'clock, always the same recording when he's particularly agitated." Miss Marple's doubts were further reinforced by a small detail she had noticed during her brief examination of the vestry. Among the scattered sheet music on the floor, she had observed a copy of "All Things Bright and Beautiful" lying open near the overturned chair. She distinctly recalled Mrs. Ashworth dismissing this hymn as insufficiently robust for the harvest service, preferring more traditional pieces. Its presence among the disturbed papers suggested it had been deliberately placed there, though for what purpose remained unclear. As the day progressed and Inspector Slack prepared to make his arrest, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that while George Ponsonby might indeed have wished Mrs. Ashworth ill, he was not the methodical killer they sought. The real murderer, she suspected, was someone far more subtle. Someone who understood that the best way to commit murder in a small village was to ensure that suspicion fell immediately and convincingly upon the most obvious suspect. The careful arrangement of evidence, the timing that prevented Mrs. Ashworth from sharing her discovery, and most tellingly, the use of her own silk scarf as the murder weapon, all pointed to a killer who understood both Mrs. Ashworth's habits and the village's prejudices well enough to orchestrate a nearly perfect crime. The question now was identifying who among St. Mary Mead's residents possessed both the necessary knowledge and the cold calculation required for such an elaborate deception. The arrest of George Ponsonby sent ripples of satisfaction and unease through St. Mary Mead in equal measure. By evening, Inspector Slack's swift resolution had been dissected in every cottage parlour, with most residents expressing relief that the matter was settled so efficiently. Yet Miss Marple, observing the village's reaction with her characteristic attention to human nature, noticed that several individuals seemed more troubled than relieved by this apparent conclusion. Mrs. Price Ridley, predictably, declared herself vindicated in her long-held suspicions about Ponsonby's temperament. "I always said there was something unsettling about his theatrical rages," she announced to anyone within hearing. "The way he glowered when corrected. Quite frightening, really, when one considers what he was capable of." Yet Miss Marple observed that beneath this public certainty, Mrs. Price Ridley appeared unusually agitated, her usual commanding presence somewhat diminished. Dr. Haydock's reaction proved more illuminating. The normally jovial physician seemed genuinely distressed by the arrest, muttering about rush to judgment and circumstantial evidence, with an intensity that suggested personal concern rather than mere professional skepticism. When Miss Marple encountered him outside the post office, his usual cheerful greeting was replaced by a distracted nod and hurried departure. It was young Sally, the postman's daughter, who provided the first concrete evidence that challenged Inspector Slack's tidy resolution. Approaching Miss Marple with obvious reluctance while she tended her garden, Sally revealed information that cast the entire investigation in a different light. "I was returning rather late from walking with Tom Fletcher," Sally confessed, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Later than I should have been, really. I took the short-cut past the church around 1 o'clock and saw someone leaving the vestry, but Miss Marple, it wasn't Mr. Ponsonby." The figure Sally described was frustratingly vague. Someone in dark clothing moving quickly through the churchyard, but one detail stood out with startling clarity. "They were carrying something white that caught the moonlight," Sally continued, "and they went toward Vicarage Lane, not toward Mr. Ponsonby's cottage at all." This revelation prompted Miss Marple to undertake her own careful examination of both the vestry and the surrounding area. Under the pretense of helping Mrs. Clement tidy the church, she returned to the scene of the crime with fresh eyes. Her methodical inspection revealed several details that Inspector Slack's hurried investigation had overlooked. The sheet music for All Things Bright and Beautiful, still lying among the scattered papers, continued to puzzle her. Mrs. Ashworth had been quite vocal in her dismissal of the hymn as insufficiently robust for a proper harvest service. Yet here it was, not merely present, but positioned as though it had been deliberately studied. More intriguingly, the paper carried a faint but distinctive scent. Lavender and rosemary mixed with something resinous, like cedar. It was the sort of careful, artisanal fragrance associated with pressed botanicals or handcrafted sachets, suggesting someone with particular domestic interests and meticulous habits. A subsequent conversation with Timothy Hartwell proved equally revealing. The young organist, still shaken by recent events, disclosed that Mrs. Price Ridley had visited him shortly after Mrs. Ashworth's death, ostensibly to offer comfort, but actually to express pointed opinions about Ponsonby's guilt. She made it very clear she'd always found him unbalanced and quite capable of something dreadful, Timothy reported with obvious discomfort. More significantly, Timothy revealed the true story behind the unwanted hymn's inclusion in the harvest program. Mrs. Price Ridley had insisted upon it, threatening to withdraw her substantial annual contribution to the church roof repairs if something more uplifting than those dreary anthems wasn't included. Mrs. Ashworth had capitulated with obvious reluctance, agreeing to include one cheerful hymn while maintaining her other selections. Miss Marple's investigation of Vicarage Lane yielded another crucial piece of evidence. Near Dr. Haydock's garden gate, embedded in the soft earth, she discovered a small pearl button of the type commonly used on choir surplices. A careful examination of the vestry cupboard confirmed that one of the newer surplices was indeed missing, its absence cleverly concealed by rearranging the remaining garments. When she discreetly verified Dr. Haydock's alibi regarding Mrs. Carmichael's difficult labor, Miss Marple uncovered a troubling discrepancy. While the doctor had indeed attended the birth, he had left for nearly an hour during the crucial time period, claiming he needed additional supplies from his surgery. "Seemed rather agitated when he returned," Mrs. Carmichael confided. said something about unexpected complications. As these various threads began to weave together in Miss Marple's mind, she realized that Inspector Slack's arrest of George Ponsonby had been precisely what the real killer intended. The careful arrangement of circumstantial evidence, the timing that prevented Mrs. Ashworth from sharing her discovery, and the use of her own silk scarf had all been designed to create an obvious suspect while concealing a far more calculated crime. The missing surplice, the distinctive scent on the hymn sheet, the witness testimony placing someone else at the scene, and the suspicious behavior of supposedly respectable villagers all pointed to a killer who understood that the best way to commit murder in a small village was to ensure suspicion fell immediately upon the most convenient target. Miss Marple suspected that the answer lay not in obvious grievances about choir reforms, but in something far more dangerous. A secret that Mrs. Ashworth's methodical nature and diplomatic experience had made her uniquely capable of uncovering, and that someone had been willing to kill to protect. The release of George Ponsonby created an atmosphere of uneasy speculation throughout St. Mary Mead, as if the village had collectively held its breath and now found itself uncertain whether to exhale in relief or draw in fresh anxiety. Inspector Slack's terse announcement that new evidence had come to light satisfied no one, least of all those residents who had already mentally convicted Ponsonby and were now forced to reconsider their assumptions about their neighbors. The shifting currents of suspicion. Mrs. Price Ridley's reaction to Ponsonby's release proved particularly telling to Miss Marple's observant eye. Rather than expressing relief at the correction of what might have been a grave injustice, she seemed genuinely agitated, her usual commanding presence notably diminished. "Well, I'm sure I don't know what to think," she declared to anyone who would listen, though her protestations carried an edge of defensiveness that had not been present during her earlier, confident pronouncements of Ponsonby's guilt. Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, appeared genuinely distressed by recent developments. His normally jovial demeanor had given way to distracted muttering about rush to judgment and circumstantial evidence, though Miss Marple noted that his concern seemed to extend beyond mere professional skepticism. When she encountered him outside the post office, his usual cheerful greeting was replaced by a hurried nod and an obvious desire to avoid conversation. A crucial discovery. It was while helping Mrs. Clement organize the choir materials for temporary storage that Miss Marple made her most significant discovery yet. Tucked beneath a stack of music folders in the vestry cupboard, she found Mrs. Ashworth's private notebook, a leather-bound volume that contained far more than the attendance records and rehearsal notes one might expect. The notebook revealed Mrs. Ashworth's methodical nature in full display. Her precise handwriting documented not only choir matters, but also careful observations about various aspects of village life. The final entries, dating from the week before her death, showed an increasing focus on what she termed irregularities requiring investigation. While Miss Marple did not examine the contents thoroughly in Mrs. Clement's presence, she noted references to discrepancies in parish accounts and patterns requiring verification with diocesan authorities. Most significantly, the final entry mentioned arranging a confidential meeting to discuss proper procedures for addressing sensitive matters affecting parish welfare. This confirmed Timothy's account of their planned meeting, while suggesting that Mrs. Ashworth's concerns extended far beyond choir arrangements. The scented clue deepens. Miss Marple's investigation of the distinctive fragrance she had noticed on the hymn sheet led her to pay a seemingly casual call on Mrs. Price Ridley, ostensibly to admire her prize-winning dahlias. The visit proved illuminating in several respects. Mrs. Price Ridley's drawing room was meticulously organized, filled with the same blend of lavender, rosemary, and cedar that had scented the "all things bright and beautiful" sheet music. More intriguingly, Mrs. Price Ridley's explanation for her recent visit to the vestry, taking charge of arrangements left in such a shocking state of incompletion, seemed at odds with Mrs. Ashworth's well-known organizational skills. Miss Marple also observed the faint dusting of white powder on Mrs. Price Ridley's sleeve, reminiscent of the chalk sometimes used for marking music or maintaining choir vestments. Historical revelations. A conversation with elderly Miss Caroline Weatherby, who lived in a cottage overlooking the disputed glebe land, provided crucial historical context. Despite her frail health, Miss Weatherby possessed a remarkably clear memory of local affairs. That land was always meant for village children, she explained with obvious conviction. A proper trust it was, established by old Lord Ashcroft for a playground and schoolhouse. But the council's been trying to get their hands on it for years, claiming all sorts of reasons why it's unsuitable. This revelation cast the glebe land dispute in an entirely new light. If the land was indeed held in trust for the village children, its proposed sale to private developers would represent not merely poor judgment, but potentially criminal misappropriation of charitable funds. Mrs. Ashworth, with her diplomatic experience and strong moral convictions, would have found such corruption intolerable. Patterns emerging. As Miss Marple walked home through the village lanes, the various threads of her investigation began to form a coherent pattern. Mrs. Ashworth's notebook suggested she had uncovered irregularities in parish financial matters. The Glebe Land Trust provided a potential source of such irregularities. The scented hymn sheet connected Mrs. Price Ridley to the crime scene in ways that went beyond her official explanations. Most tellingly, the timing of Mrs. Ashworth's murder, occurring just before her planned meeting with Timothy to discuss proper procedures, suggested that someone had been desperate to prevent her from sharing her discoveries with church authorities. The killer had possessed detailed knowledge of both Mrs. Ashworth's investigation and her plans, indicating someone closely connected to parish affairs. The web tightens. Miss Marple's subsequent observations of village behavior revealed additional troubling patterns. Mrs. Price Ridley's insistence on Ponsonby's guilt had been remarkably swift and confident, as if she had been prepared with an explanation before the crime was fully investigated. Dr. Haydock's alibi for the crucial hours, while superficially credible, contained gaps that became more significant upon closer examination. The missing choir surplice, the pearl button found near Dr. Haydock's gate, and Sally's testimony about the direction taken by the mysterious figure all pointed toward a carefully planned crime designed to deflect suspicion onto convenient scapegoats while protecting the true perpetrators. As evening approached and the village settled into its routines, Miss Marple reflected that the harvest festival would indeed serve as a fitting climax to recent events. Mrs. Ashworth had uncovered corruption that threatened to expose respected members of the community, and someone had been willing to commit murder to protect their secrets. The question now was how to reveal the truth in a way that would ensure justice while minimizing the damage to innocent members of the community who had trusted the wrong people. The careful documentation in Mrs. Ashworth's notebook, combined with the physical evidence and witness testimony, was beginning to paint a picture of calculated criminality hidden beneath the veneer of village respectability. Soon, Miss Marple suspected, the pressure of maintaining false appearances would prove too much for the guilty parties, and the truth would emerge with the inexorable force of justice, long delayed. The days following George Ponsonby's release settled over St. Mary Mead like a heavy blanket of uncertainty. The village, which had briefly exhaled in collective relief at having identified a culprit, now found itself holding its breath once more. The comfortable certainty of Ponsonby's guilt had been replaced by something far more unsettling, the knowledge that the real murderer remained among them, hidden behind a familiar face and a respectable facade. Miss Marple observed this shift in the village's collective mood with the keen attention she brought to all manifestations of human nature. Where once there had been shocked whispers about obvious suspects, now there were careful silences and sidelong glances. Neighbors who had gossiped freely about Ponsonby's temperament now measured their words with unusual care, as if suddenly aware that speculation might prove dangerously accurate in unexpected directions. The choir's uneasy continuation. It was during the evening choir rehearsal, 3 days after Ponsonby's release, that the first significant crack appeared in the village's carefully maintained composure. Timothy Hartwell had assumed the role of interim director with touching dedication, though his gentle manner lacked Mrs. Ashworth's commanding presence. The choir members, still shaken by recent events, responded to his leadership with a mixture of loyalty and barely concealed anxiety. Mrs. Price Ridley's entrance during the rehearsal proved particularly revealing to Miss Marple's observant eye. The woman who usually swept into any gathering with imperious confidence now moved with visible stiffness, her shoulders held rigidly, and her usual commanding presence notably diminished. When she discovered that her favored hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful, had been replaced with one of Mrs. Ashworth's more traditional selections, her reaction was swift and sharp. "Really, Timothy," she declared with an edge that cut through the evening air, "I trust this is merely a temporary adjustment. The congregation expects something uplifting, not these dreary, ponderous anthems that Cordelia insisted upon." Timothy, flushing but maintaining his dignity, replied quietly, "We wish to honor Mrs. Ashworth's original program as far as possible. She had very definite views about what was appropriate for the harvest service." "Quite," Mrs. Price Ridley retorted with unmistakable bitterness. "And look where those definite views led her." The remark drew shocked silence from the assembled choir members. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in her corner seat, noted the immediate reactions. Mrs. Clement's face crumpled with distress. Young Sally paled visibly. And most significantly, Dr. Haydock shot a sharp, involuntary glance toward Mrs. Price Ridley. The sort of look exchanged between people who share dangerous secrets and fear they have been brought too close to the surface. Revelations in the Vestry. Later, as the rehearsal concluded and choir members gathered their belongings, Miss Marple remained in her seat, ostensibly untangling her knitting wool, while actually listening to the conversations drifting from the vestry. The casual exchanges proved more illuminating than any formal interrogation might have been. "Inspector Slack seems convinced now that this was entirely a parish matter," Timothy was explaining to Mrs. Clement, his voice carrying clearly in the church's acoustic. "He believes someone within our own community was desperate enough to commit murder." Mrs. Clement's reply trembled with emotion. "To think that someone we see every Sunday, someone who shares in our worship, could be capable of such a thing. Cordelia confided in me. You know, just before she died. She mentioned being troubled by certain financial irregularities and wanted to ensure the parish was properly protected." Dr. Haydock's voice, when it came, carried an uncharacteristic sharpness. "Best not to dwell on such speculation. The police have their methods. What good does it do to suspect every person in the village?" There was a pause before Mrs. Clement continued more quietly. She was quite specific about her concerns. Said she had discovered patterns that reminded her of a case her husband had encountered during his diplomatic service. Systematic misappropriation disguised as legitimate expenses. A careful confrontation. The following afternoon, Miss Marple paid what appeared to be a routine social call on Dr. Haydock, carrying a tin of her seed cake as justification for the visit. She found the usually jovial physician in his surgery, looking haggard and distinctly irritable, though he could hardly refuse to receive her. Their conversation began with polite inquiries about Mrs. Carmichael and her new baby, but Miss Marple's gentle persistence soon steered it toward more significant territory. "One hears of such unfortunate muddles in parish affairs," she remarked with apparent innocence, adjusting her spectacles thoughtfully. "Funds mislaid, receipts miscopied. Poor Mrs. Ashworth was so very conscientious about such matters. I suppose once one begins examining things closely, one must be quite thorough." Dr. Haydock's hand, reaching for his pipe, hesitated almost imperceptibly. "Villages thrive on small muddles, Miss Marple. Clear everything up completely, and half the community would collapse from embarrassment. "Oh, indeed," Miss Marple agreed placidly, "though I dare say it becomes rather more serious when charitable trusts are involved. Land meant for village children being sold for private development, for instance. There was such a case in Little Dipping. Quite shocking. Mrs. Ashworth, with her diplomatic experience, would have recognized such patterns immediately." The doctor's sharp look carried a wariness that had not been present in their previous conversations. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "Suggesting?" Her eyebrows rose with delicate surprise. "My dear doctor, I'm far too old to suggest anything at all. I merely observe how very strained you've appeared recently. The responsibility of attending that difficult birth, followed by all this unpleasantness, it must have been quite exhausting. You walked home alone that night, I suppose. The roads can be so lonely in the small hours." For a moment, something almost like panic flickered in his eyes before he forced a laugh. "At my age, Miss Marple, one is hardly troubled by lonely roads or dark churchyards." As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple's keen nose detected the same distinctive blend of lavender, rosemary, and cedar that she had noticed on the displaced hymn sheet, a scent that clung faintly to the doctor's coat hanging by the surgery door. The missing pieces. That evening brought a crucial revelation when Sally, the postman's daughter, appeared at Miss Marple's cottage, under the pretense of returning a borrowed book. The young woman's obvious nervousness suggested she carried information of considerable importance. "I didn't tell everything before, Miss Marple," Sally confessed, twisting her gloves anxiously. "That night when I saw someone leaving the vestry, they weren't just carrying something white. Near the yew tree by the churchyard wall, I heard a snap, like fabric tearing or a button coming loose. And then," she hesitated, then continued in a rush, "I met Dr. Haydock near his garden gate. He seemed startled to see me, and he was in his shirt sleeves, which seemed odd for that hour. He had something white folded over his arm." Miss Marple received this information with her characteristic calm, though inwardly she felt the satisfaction of seeing scattered pieces finally forming a coherent pattern. The missing choir surplice, the pearl button discovered near the doctor's gate, the scented evidence linking Mrs. Price Ridley to the crime scene, and now this witness testimony placing Dr. Haydock at the crucial location with suspicious items, all pointed toward a conspiracy more elaborate than simple village resentment. As Sally departed with gentle assurances, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The case against Mrs. Ashworth's murderers was becoming clear, though several crucial elements remained to be confirmed. The financial irregularities Mrs. Ashworth had discovered, the desperate measures taken to silence her, and the careful staging designed to implicate innocent parties all suggested criminals of considerable cunning and respectability. The Harvest Festival, now just days away, would provide the perfect opportunity for the final confrontation. In the same sacred space where Mrs. Ashworth had died for her dedication to truth and justice, Miss Marple would ensure that her killers faced the consequences of their calculated cruelty. The gentle old lady's blue eyes held a steely determination as she contemplated the approaching climax. Soon, very soon, the careful facade maintained by St. Mary Mead's most respectable criminals would crumble under the weight of evidence and the inexorable pressure of justice long delayed. The Harvest Festival morning dawned with that particular clarity that often follows periods of tension, as if the very air of St. Mary Mead had been washed clean by the approaching resolution of its troubles. Miss Marple, adjusting her hat before her cottage mirror, reflected that such atmospheric portents were rarely coincidental. In her experience, the most significant revelations often occurred when people believed themselves safely hidden behind the comfortable routines of village life. The festival's deceptive serenity. The Church of St. Bartholomew presented a picture of seasonal abundance that would have delighted Mrs. Ashworth's organizational sensibilities. Sheaves of golden wheat flanked the altar, while baskets of apples and late roses created a tapestry of autumn colors throughout the nave. The familiar sense of harvest, grain and fruit mingled with the church's perpetual perfume of old wood and candle wax, provided a comforting backdrop that made the undercurrents of anxiety all the more noticeable to Miss Marple's experienced eye. She had spent the previous evening in careful preparation, not merely for worship, but for what she hoped would be the crucial test of her developing theory. The conversation with Mrs. Clement had yielded Mrs. Ashworth's private notebook, which Miss Marple had studied with the methodical attention she gave to all significant documents. The final entries, written in Mrs. Ashworth's precise diplomatic hand, revealed a pattern of financial irregularities that extended far beyond simple accounting errors. The notebook contained detailed observations about systematic discrepancies in charitable fund allocation and patterns reminiscent of embassy corruption cases. Most tellingly, the margins bore 3 sets of initials accompanied by question marks: H, medical authority; PR, social influence; and C, administrative control. Mrs. Ashworth had been circling around a conspiracy that involved respected members of the community using their positions to systematically embezzle parish funds through the proposed glebe land sale. The pressure of observation. As the congregation gathered for the morning service, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the key figures in her investigation. Mrs. Price Ridley entered with her customary imperious bearing, though her movements carried a brittleness that had not been present in previous weeks. Her usual commanding presence seemed forced, as though she were working particularly hard to maintain control over both her expression and her circumstances. Dr. Haydock took his place in the choir stalls with obvious reluctance, his medical bag positioned beside him in an unusual departure from normal practice. The good doctor's typically robust appearance had deteriorated noticeably over recent days. His hands showed a slight tremor when he handled his hymnal, and his complexion had acquired the grayish pallor that Miss Marple associated with sustained psychological stress. Timothy Hartwell, nervous but determined in his role as interim choir director, had agreed to Miss Marple's unusual request regarding the morning's musical program. The service would conclude with All Things Bright and Beautiful, the hymn that Mrs. Price Ridley had insisted upon and that Mrs. Ashworth had reluctantly included. It was, Miss Marple had explained to Timothy, a matter of honoring both women's contributions to the parish music program, though her true purpose was rather different. The crucial discovery. During the opening prayers, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small detail that confirmed her suspicions. Among Mrs. Ashworth's papers, she had discovered a brown envelope containing photocopied financial documents that revealed the full scope of the glebe land fraud. The papers showed a complex series of transactions where the charitable trust land was sold to a shell company at a drastically undervalued price, then immediately resold to developers at market value, with the substantial difference disappearing through inflated consultancy fees and administrative oversight charges. The names on these fraudulent invoices were precisely those she had suspected. Dr. Haydock listed as a property valuation consultant and Mrs. Price Ridley cited as an administrative oversight specialist. The dates corresponded exactly with Mrs. Ashworth's notebook entries about irregularities requiring immediate diocesan attention. This was the evidence that Mrs. Ashworth had intended to present to church authorities. The discovery that had cost her life. The psychological test begins. As the service progressed through its familiar rhythms, Miss Marple waited for the crucial moment. During the Reverend Clement's sermon on stewardship and the proper care of charitable trusts, she observed the reactions of her suspects with clinical precision. The vicar, perhaps unconsciously influenced by recent events, spoke with unusual clarity about the responsibilities of those entrusted with community resources. Those who divert charitable funds from their intended purpose, he said, his voice gaining unexpected strength, betray not only their fellow parishioners, but the very principles of Christian stewardship. Such actions, however cleverly disguised, cannot remain hidden indefinitely. The effect on Mrs. Price Ridley and Dr. Haydock was immediate and telling. Mrs. Price Ridley's gloved hands tightened visibly on her prayer book, while the doctor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief, despite the church's coolness. The hymn's revelation. When the time came for the final hymn, Miss Marple's carefully laid plan reached its climax. As Timothy announced, "All things bright and beautiful," he added quietly, "This hymn was included at the specific insistence of one of our most generous parishioners." Mrs. Ashworth, though she had reservations, believed in honoring commitments made to those who supported the church financially. The emphasis on financial support and Mrs. Ashworth's reluctant compliance had precisely the effect Miss Marple had anticipated. Mrs. Price Ridley gave an involuntary start, a reflexive reaction of guilt at hearing her coercive tactics described so accurately. More significantly, the glance that passed between her and Dr. Haydock carried the unmistakable panic of co-conspirators, realizing that their careful control of the narrative was beginning to slip. The trap closes. As the congregation began to disperse after the service, Miss Marple moved with apparent casualness toward Inspector Slack, who had positioned himself discreetly near the church entrance. Her words, though spoken quietly, carried the weight of certainty. "Inspector, I believe it would be beneficial if Mrs. Price Ridley and Dr. Haydock could join us in the vestry for a brief discussion. There are several matters regarding Mrs. Ashworth's final investigations that require clarification, and I suspect they may be able to provide the insights we need." Inspector Slack, who had learned through experience to trust Miss Marple's gentle suggestions, nodded grimly. As the four of them, inspector, doctor, matron, and elderly spinster, made their way toward the vestry where the crime had occurred, Miss Marple reflected that the Harvest Festival was indeed providing its own form of reckoning. The careful facade that had protected St. Mary Mead's most calculating criminals was about to crumble under the inexorable pressure of truth and justice. In the small stone room where Mrs. Ashworth had died for her dedication to honesty and proper stewardship, the final confrontation was about to begin. The gentle old lady's blue eyes held a steely determination as she prepared to ensure that the murdered woman's commitment to truth would not have been in vain. The vestry, bathed in the soft autumn light filtering through its ancient leaded window, seemed to hold its breath as the four figures arranged themselves within its stone walls. Miss Marple settled into her chair with characteristic composure, her knitting bag positioned carefully beside her, while Inspector Slack took his position near the door with professional alertness. Dr. Haydock and Mrs. Price Ridley occupied chairs with the careful dignity of people determined to maintain their respectability under scrutiny, though Miss Marple's keen eye noted the subtle signs of strain in both their postures. The gentle beginning of truth. "I do hope you'll forgive me for requesting this meeting," Miss Marple began with her customary mildness, adjusting her spectacles thoughtfully. "But there are certain matters regarding poor Mrs. Ashworth's final investigations that simply will not rest until they are properly explained. You see, I've discovered that her concerns extended far beyond choir arrangements or musical preferences." Mrs. Price Ridley's response came with characteristic sharpness, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension that had not been present in their earlier conversations. "Really, Miss Marple, I cannot imagine what assistance I could possibly provide. The police have already questioned me thoroughly about that dreadful business." "Indeed they have," Miss Marple agreed placidly, reaching into her knitting bag. "But sometimes it's not what one says that proves illuminating, but rather what one chooses not to mention." She withdrew Mrs. Ashworth's leather-bound notebook and the brown envelope containing the photocopied documents. Mrs. Ashworth was remarkably thorough in her investigations, you know. Her diplomatic training served her well in uncovering what she termed systematic irregularities in charitable fund allocation. The evidence unfolds. Dr. Haydock shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usual jovial demeanor notably absent. "Good heavens, what are you suggesting?" Village finances are hardly a matter for melodramatic speculation. Oh, but they are when they involve the deliberate misappropriation of funds intended for the village children, Miss Marple replied with gentle steel in her voice. She opened the envelope and carefully arranged several documents on the small table where Mrs. Ashworth had once kept her rehearsal notes. These papers, which Mrs. Ashworth obtained through her methodical investigation, reveal a rather elaborate scheme involving the Glebe Land Trust. The documents, even at a glance, spoke of calculated deception. Miss Marple pointed delicately to the relevant figures. The trust land, which Miss Weatherby remembers was specifically bequeathed for the children of the parish, was valued by the diocese at £12,000. Yet here we see it was sold to Meridian Holdings Limited for the remarkably low sum of £3,000. Inspector Slack leaned forward with professional interest as Miss Marple continued. Most curious of all, Meridian Holdings immediately resold the property to Ashcroft Developments for £15,000, a profit of £12,000 on a transaction completed within a matter of days. Mrs. Price Ridley's gloved hands tightened visibly on her handbag. Property transactions often involve complex valuations and market fluctuations. Such variations are perfectly normal in legitimate business dealings. Perhaps, Miss Marple conceded mildly, but what is rather less normal are these invoices. She indicated additional documents with careful precision. A consultancy fee of £2,000 paid to Dr. Leonard Haydock for expert property valuation services, despite his lack of surveying qualifications, and an administrative oversight honorarium of £1,500 paid to Mrs. Beatrice Price Ridley for managing a sale process that should have required no special oversight. The conspiracy revealed. The silence that followed carried the weight of exposed secrets. Dr. Haydock's face had drained of color, while Mrs. Price Ridley's carefully maintained composure showed the first genuine cracks. Mrs. Ashworth recognized the pattern immediately. Miss Marple continued with relentless gentleness. Her notebook contains detailed observations about schemes she had encountered during her husband's diplomatic service, systematic embezzlement disguised as legitimate administrative expenses. She documented every irregularity, obtained copies of all relevant papers, and scheduled a meeting with the diocesan authorities to report her findings. Miss Marple's blue eyes moved from one suspect to the other with quiet intensity. That meeting, arranged for the Monday following her death, would have exposed the entire conspiracy. You simply could not allow it to take place. Dr. Haydock attempted a bluff tone that failed to conceal his growing desperation. This is preposterous speculation based on coincidental paperwork. You're suggesting that respected members of this community would commit murder over accounting irregularities. Not accounting irregularities, Doctor, Miss Marple corrected with gentle firmness. Theft. The systematic theft of funds intended for the welfare of village children, disguised through fraudulent companies and fabricated consultancy fees. Mrs. Ashworth understood exactly what she had uncovered, and she was prepared to ensure that justice was done. The method of murder. Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag once more, producing a small pearl button and a fabric sample. The physical evidence supports the financial documentation quite conclusively. This button, found near Dr. Haydock's garden gate, came from one of the choir surplices, a surplice that has mysteriously disappeared from the vestry cupboard. She turned to address the doctor directly. You left Mrs. Carmichael's bedside that night, claiming to need additional supplies from your surgery. In fact, you met Mrs. Price Ridley and together came to the church. You wore the surplice over your dark clothing to move through the churchyard without attracting attention. After all, an early rising chorister near the church would occasion no surprise. Mrs. Price Ridley's mask of respectability finally began to crumble completely. She was going to destroy everything, years of service to this community, and she would have thrown it all away over a few financial technicalities. Technicalities? Miss Marple's voice carried genuine indignation. You stole money from children's charitable funds and murdered a dedicated woman to conceal your crimes. Mrs. Ashworth trusted you both. She came to the vestry that night believing she was meeting allies in her quest for proper stewardship. The final revelation. Miss Marple's reconstruction of the crime revealed a conspiracy of calculated brutality hidden beneath respectable facades. Mrs. Price Ridley arranged the meeting under the pretense of discussing the hymn selection, knowing Mrs. Ashworth's punctual habits would bring her to the vestry early and alone. Dr. Haydock was waiting, and when Mrs. Ashworth's back was turned, perhaps as she organized her music, he used her own silk scarf to strangle her. The evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. The scattered sheet music, including the all things bright and beautiful hymn that Mrs. Price Ridley had insisted upon, was deliberately arranged to suggest choir-related motives. The distinctive scent of lavender, rosemary, and cedar from Mrs. Price Ridley's drawing room clung to the music sheets, while the missing surplice provided forensic protection for the actual killer. You even attempted to frame poor George Ponsonby, Miss Marple continued with quiet steel. Mrs. Price Ridley, you were remarkably quick to suggest his guilt, visiting Timothy Hartwell within hours of the discovery to emphasize how unbalanced and quite capable of something dreadful George had become. The confession. The psychological pressure of Miss Marple's gentle but relentless logic finally proved too much. Mrs. Price Ridley's carefully constructed facade collapsed entirely, and she began to weep, harsh, uncontrolled sobs that shocked even Inspector Slack with their raw intensity. She wouldn't listen to reason, Mrs. Price Ridley cried, her voice breaking. We tried to explain about the greater good, about serving the community efficiently. But she was so inflexible, so determined to pursue her ridiculous investigation. Dr. Haydock, seeing his co-conspirator's complete breakdown, surrendered to the inevitable. His shoulders slumped with defeat as he spoke in barely audible tones. We never intended for it to go so far. The financial arrangements were meant to benefit the community. Hospitals, scholarships, improvements. But Mrs. Ashworth saw only the irregularities, not the good work being done. The good work of systematic theft? Miss Marple asked with quiet finality. Doctor, you murdered a woman whose only crime was refusing to ignore the embezzlement of children's charitable funds. Resolution and reflection. Inspector Slack stepped forward with grim professionalism. Dr. Leonard Haydock, Mrs. Beatrice Price Ridley, I'm arresting you both on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and the murder of Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be used as evidence. As the handcuffs were applied and the conspirators led away, Miss Marple remained in the vestry, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The room seemed somehow lighter now that the truth had been revealed, though she felt no satisfaction in the resolution. Mrs. Ashworth had died for her commitment to honesty and proper stewardship, while those who should have shared her values had chosen greed and calculated violence instead. The Harvest Festival, with its celebration of abundance and gratitude, had indeed provided its own form of reckoning. The careful facade that had protected St. Mary Mead's most calculating criminals had crumbled under the inexorable pressure of truth and justice. Yet Miss Marple could not help reflecting that the real harvest was a bitter one. The knowledge that respectability and community service could mask hearts capable of the coldest calculation and most brutal betrayal. Outside, the bells of St. Bartholomew's continued to ring joyfully for the harvest celebration, but in the small stone vestry, the atmosphere was heavy with the consequences of greed, pride, and carefully rationalized wrongdoing brought finally into the clear, uncompromising light of justice. Mrs. Ashworth's dedication to truth had been vindicated, though at a cost that no one should have been required to pay. The weeks following the arrests settled over St. Mary Mead like the gradual transition from autumn to winter, a slow process of adjustment to a fundamentally altered landscape. The village, which had prided itself on knowing its residents thoroughly, was forced to confront the unsettling reality that two of its most respected citizens had been capable of calculated murder to conceal systematic theft from children's charitable funds. Miss Marple observed the community's collective response with her characteristic attention to human nature's complexities. The initial shock had given way to a more nuanced understanding of how respectability could mask corruption and how the very qualities that made someone trusted could be weaponized to facilitate criminal behavior. Mrs. Clement, still struggling to process the revelation, confided her distress during one of Miss Marple's visits to the vicarage. "To think that we trusted them so completely," she said, her voice trembling with genuine anguish. Dr. Haydock attended the births of half the village children, and Mrs. Price Ridley organized our charity drives for 20 years. How does one reconcile such service with such calculated evil? "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently. "That is precisely why they were able to continue for so long. Their genuine contributions to community life provided perfect camouflage for their criminal activities. People rarely suspect those who have earned their gratitude and respect." George Ponsonby's vindication brought its own complications. The man who had been so readily suspected found himself both exonerated and somehow diminished by the experience. His pompous manner, previously dismissed as merely irritating, now seemed almost endearing in its transparent honesty. "I suppose I should feel gratified," he confided to Miss Marple. "But knowing how quickly everyone accepted my guilt makes one wonder what sort of impression one has been making." Timothy Hartwell had grown visibly in confidence during his unexpected tenure as interim choir director. His gentle manner and genuine musical knowledge had earned him respect that transcended his previous status. When he approached Miss Marple with his proposal for a memorial scholarship, his earnestness was touching. She cared so very much about the children and that land being used properly. Perhaps we might establish something for any village child who wished to learn music. We could call it the Ashworth Music Fund. The financial investigation, conducted with diocesan oversight, revealed the conspiracy's full scope. The glebe land fraud was merely the most recent manifestation of a scheme operating for nearly 5 years. Systematic overcharging for medical services, inflated charity event invoices, and manipulated property transactions had diverted thousands of pounds from charitable purposes. The parish council, chastened by events, implemented new oversight procedures and transparency requirements designed to prevent such concentrations of power. The memorial service for Mrs. Ashworth, held 3 weeks after the arrests, provided the village with an opportunity to honor both her memory and the principles for which she had died. The Reverend Clement's eulogy captured her essence. She died because she refused to allow the theft of resources meant for our community's most vulnerable members. Her commitment to proper stewardship cost her life, but ensured that justice would ultimately prevail. The glebe land, recovered through legal action, was established as a proper trust with transparent oversight. A small playground and community garden were planned, ensuring the land would serve its original purpose. Mrs. Ashworth's name was inscribed on a simple stone marker, identifying her as the woman whose dedication to truth had protected the community's charitable resources. As winter settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the case's broader implications during her quiet evening hours. The murder had revealed dark currents beneath the village's placid surface, but had also demonstrated the power of methodical investigation and moral courage to expose corruption and ensure justice. The village had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself, but had emerged stronger and more genuinely united. Trust would now be balanced with verification, and respectability would require constant moral vigilance to remain genuine. The choir, under Timothy's direction, achieved a level of musical excellence that honored Mrs. Ashworth's memory while reflecting his gentler approach to leadership. Walking home through quiet lanes on a crisp December evening, Miss Marple reflected that Mrs. Ashworth's greatest victory was not exposing the conspiracy, but demonstrating that ordinary moral courage could triumph over calculated evil. The gentle old lady's blue eyes held satisfaction as she contemplated the restored peace of St. Mary Mead, a peace built not on comfortable ignorance, but on the solid foundation of truth acknowledged and justice served. The village slept quietly under its blanket of winter stars, secure in knowing its charitable resources were properly protected and its leadership genuinely committed to service rather than self-enrichment. Mrs. Ashworth's legacy lived on in the increased vigilance and moral awareness of those she had died to protect, ensuring her sacrifice had not been in vain. The spring that followed brought a different quality of light to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself had emerged from a long shadow into clearer air. Miss Marple, tending her garden on a particularly lovely April morning, observed the subtle but significant changes with the satisfaction of someone who understood that genuine healing required both acknowledgement of past wrongs and commitment to future vigilance. The weight of justice. The trial of Dr. Haydock and Mrs. Price Ridley had concluded the previous month with convictions that brought both relief and sobering reflection to the community. Dr. Haydock received a sentence of life imprisonment, while Mrs. Price Ridley, whose role as the conspiracy's architect earned particular condemnation, received the same with a recommendation against early parole. The evidence, Mrs. Ashworth's meticulous documentation, the physical evidence, and their eventual confessions had left no room for reasonable doubt. The financial investigation revealed the conspiracy's devastating scope. Over nearly 6 years, the pair had systematically embezzled more than £15,000 from various charitable funds, using their respected positions to manipulate transactions and create fraudulent invoices. The recovered funds, supplemented by assets confiscated from both conspirators, had been returned to their proper charitable purposes, ensuring that Mrs. Ashworth's sacrifice had not been entirely in vain. A village transformed. The return of ordinary routine was gradual rather than dramatic, like the slow lengthening of days after winter solstice. Yet Miss Marple could almost pinpoint the week when conversation at the post office began to concern seed catalogues more often than embezzlement, and when Mrs. Ashworth's murder became the solemn aside rather than the central topic. At the post office one morning, Miss Marple witnessed a telling exchange. Mrs. Clement, packaging books for the Missionary Society, hesitated when calculating postage. "Would you mind, Mrs. Weatherby," she said apologetically, "if you stamped the receipt paid and noted the parish account on the back? I do hate muddles with charitable moneys nowadays." "Quite right too, ma'am," Mrs. Weatherby replied briskly. "All parish accounts are to be countersigned now. Best way to keep things tidy." No one protested that such measures implied distrust. Rather, there was a general air of relieved common sense, as though everyone recognized that proper oversight might have prevented the tragedy entirely. Character renewed. Timothy Hartwell's transformation from nervous accompanist to confident choir director had become one of the few genuinely positive outcomes. The Ashworth Music Fund, established with recovered money, had already enabled 3 village children to begin musical studies. Timothy, though still earnest, now carried himself with quiet authority that Mrs. Ashworth herself would have approved of. She would have been pleased about the children, Mrs. Clement confided to Miss Marple during one of their regular tea visits. The scholarship recipients are so enthusiastic, and Timothy has such a gift for encouraging young talent without intimidation. George Ponsonby's vindication had brought unexpected personal growth. His pompous manner, tempered by the humility of false accusation, now carried genuine authority when he spoke about careful judgment and presuming innocence. "I learned something valuable about the danger of convenient explanations," he admitted to Miss Marple. "The village was so eager to identify a culprit that they nearly sent an innocent man to prison." Institutional safeguards. The parish council had undergone complete reorganization with new transparency requirements designed to prevent future concentration of power. All financial transactions now required multiple signatures and independent verification, while charitable funds were subject to quarterly diocesan audits. Colonel Melchett, initially grumbling about committees and paperwork, had grudgingly acknowledged their necessity. "Whole new system of oversight," he informed Miss Marple near the village green. "Dashed nuisance, but necessary, I suppose." "I have always found," Miss Marple observed mildly, "that people of good conscience are rarely inconvenienced by truth being clearly written down." Living Memorial. The Glebe Land project had progressed beautifully under community oversight. The playground, completed in March, bore a simple plaque dedicating it to Mrs. Ashworth's memory and commitment to proper stewardship. Children's laughter now filled the space that had nearly been lost to corrupt development, providing daily proof that her sacrifice had protected something genuinely valuable. The community garden, tended by village volunteers, had grown alongside the playground. The simple stone marker commemorating Mrs. Ashworth stood at its edge, a quiet guardian reminding all who passed that vigilance was the price of peace. Lessons in trust. One afternoon, young Sally approached Miss Marple with obvious concern. "Mum says you always see things clearly. How do you go on trusting people after all that happened?" Miss Marple considered her thoughtfully. "One doesn't trust blindly, my dear," she said gently. "But one must not cease to trust altogether. One observes, one listens, one watches how people behave when there is no advantage in behaving well. And one remembers that wickedness is rarely general. It is particular, found in this person, not that. In this situation, not every situation." Sally nodded slowly. "I suppose if no one trusted anyone, there'd be no village at all." "Exactly," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. "Evil depends very much on people assuming that all is well and need never be questioned. But good, true good, depends on seeing things as they are and still choosing to be kind." The deeper current. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the case's enduring lessons. Mrs. Ashworth's murder had revealed how easily trust could be exploited by those willing to weaponize respectability for criminal purposes. Yet it had also demonstrated the power of methodical investigation, moral courage, and community solidarity to expose corruption and ensure justice. The village had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths. The ease with which residents accepted convenient explanations, the dangerous concentration of unchecked power, and the vulnerability of charitable resources to systematic exploitation. These revelations, while painful, had ultimately strengthened the community's commitment to genuine transparency and shared responsibility. Miss Marple's final reflection. Walking through the village lanes that evening, Miss Marple noted the subtle but significant changes in how residents interacted. Conversations carried new depth of genuine concern, while community decisions reflected increased attention to accountability. Trust remained, but balanced with appropriate verification, a more honest foundation for village life. Human nature would never change in its essentials, she knew. There would always be vanity, greed, and self-deception, often wrapped in the language of service and greater good. There would also always be courage, conscience, and the small, stubborn acts of decency that kept communities from collapsing into suspicion and fear. St. Mary Mead had not become a different place. It had simply become more itself, its virtues clearer, and its dangers more openly acknowledged. The comfortable illusion of impenetrable respectability had been replaced by something more valuable, a mature understanding that genuine peace required constant, gentle vigilance. The gentle old lady's blue eyes held quiet satisfaction as she contemplated the village's evolution. Mrs. Ashworth's legacy lived on not merely in memorial scholarships or playground dedications, but in the community's renewed commitment to the principles of honest stewardship and moral courage that had cost her life. In the distance, children's voices carried on the evening air from the recovered glebe land, bright, quarrelsome, and happy. Mrs. Ashworth's sacrifice had not been in vain. The harvest of justice, though long in coming, had finally been gathered in full measure. The first anniversary of Mrs. Ashworth's death arrived with the quiet dignity of an English summer morning, bringing with it the sort of clear, gentle light that seemed to wash the shadows from even the most troubled corners of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, making her way to the special memorial service with a modest bouquet of garden roses, reflected that 12 months had proven sufficient time for the village to absorb the full implications of the tragedy while moving forward with renewed purpose and deeper wisdom. The memorial service, held in the church rather than the vestry where the crime had occurred, carried profound significance for the entire community. Timothy Hartwell, now permanently appointed as choir director, had prepared a program that would have satisfied Mrs. Ashworth's exacting standards while reflecting his own gentler approach to leadership. The music was traditional, well-rehearsed, and performed with genuine reverence rather than mere duty. Even the controversial "All Things Bright and Beautiful" was included, not as a concession to manipulation, but as a reminder that beauty could emerge from the most painful circumstances. The Reverend Clement's voice, steady with conviction, captured both the loss and the legacy. She died because she refused to allow the theft of resources meant for our most vulnerable. Her commitment to truth has become the foundation upon which we have rebuilt our community's trust. The institutional changes implemented in the wake of the scandal had proven both effective and surprisingly popular. Colonel Melchett, initially resistant to additional oversight, now served as chairman of the Financial Committee with evident satisfaction. "Dashed good system, actually," he confided to Miss Marple after the service. "Everyone knows where every penny goes, and there's no room for creative accounting." The quarterly diocesan audits had revealed no irregularities, while the requirement for multiple signatures had created a culture of shared responsibility that extended far beyond financial matters. George Ponsonby's transformation from pompous tenor to thoughtful community member had become one of the case's most heartening outcomes. His experience of false accusation had taught him valuable lessons about presumption and the danger of convenient explanations. "I learned that being obvious doesn't make one guilty," he told Miss Marple with newfound humility, "and that respectability can be the perfect disguise for wickedness." His attention to detail and insistence on proper procedure now helped prevent the administrative lapses that had enabled the original conspiracy. The Ashworth Music Fund had flourished beyond expectations, supporting not only individual lessons, but also a lending library of instruments and a thriving youth choir. The children who benefited carried no knowledge of the fund's tragic origins, knowing only that their community valued their musical education. Miss Marple had observed these young musicians with particular pleasure. Their enthusiasm embodied the future Mrs. Ashworth had died to protect. Walking through the village that afternoon, Miss Marple noted the subtle but significant changes in how residents interacted. The easy trust that had once characterized neighborly relations was now tempered with appropriate vigilance, but without descending into suspicion. People were more careful with their judgments, more thoughtful in their assessments, and perhaps more genuinely kind in their daily dealings. The comfortable illusion of impenetrable respectability had been replaced by something more valuable. Mature understanding that genuine peace required constant, gentle watchfulness. The glebe land, transformed into a thriving community garden and playground, provided daily evidence of Mrs. Ashworth's vindication. Children's laughter echoed where greed had once plotted, while the simple memorial stone bore its quiet inscription. She guarded this land for the children of St. Mary Mead. The sight never failed to move Miss Marple, representing as it did the triumph of intended purpose over calculated exploitation. As evening settled over the village, Miss Marple reflected on the case's enduring lessons about human nature and community life. Dr. Haydock and Mrs. Price Ridley had exploited their positions not through dramatic villainy, but through the gradual erosion of proper boundaries, using their respectability as both weapon and shield. Their crime had been as much about betraying community trust as stealing money, and their punishment had needed to address both aspects of their wrongdoing. Yet the village had not succumbed to cynicism. Instead, it had chosen to learn, implementing new safeguards while maintaining its essential character. The residents now understood that true respectability required constant moral vigilance rather than comfortable assumptions about familiar faces. Settling into her favorite chair with her knitting, Miss Marple considered the intricate tapestry of human existence. The threads of good and evil were inextricably woven, often indistinguishable until sharp eyes or tragic events brought them into stark relief. She felt no triumph in the unmasking of the murderers, only quiet satisfaction that justice had been served and truth honored. Mrs. Ashworth's sacrifice had not been in vain. The principles of honest stewardship and moral courage for which she had died continued to guide the community she had served so faithfully. The harvest of justice, though long in coming and bitter in its gathering, had ultimately yielded the most precious crop of all, a deeper wisdom about the price of peace and the eternal necessity of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Human nature would never change in its essentials, Miss Marple knew, but communities could learn to recognize its dangers while nurturing its virtues. That, perhaps, was the most fitting memorial to Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth. Not monuments of stone, but living commitment to the values that made civilized life possible.